The first thing I heard was crystal shattering across the ballroom floor. Not laughter, not music. Glass. Every conversation inside the Whitmore Country Club stopped dead at the same moment. I remember turning slowly toward the entrance while 100 wealthy wedding guests stared in complete silence. An elderly man near the front had gone pale as paper. His whiskey tumbler had slipped right out of his hand and exploded against the marble floor. His eyes were locked on me. Not on my sister in her wedding gown. Not on the groom. Me. The old man's lips trembled like he'd seen a ghost crawl out of a grave. Then he whispered the words that changed the entire night. "Holy shit," he breathed. "She's the Reaper widow of the Seals." You could feel the air leave the room. My father froze beside him. My mother looked confused. My sister Emily stopped smiling halfway through greeting her guests. And suddenly every person in that ballroom was staring at me like they were seeing me for the first time in their lives. Funny thing is, I'd been invisible to my family for almost 15 years. Especially after the war. Especially after Afghanistan. Especially after I came home different. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Claire Walker. I'm 38 years old, retired Navy Special Operations Support Command, though most of my service record still technically doesn't exist to the public. I live alone outside Virginia Beach with an old yellow lab named Murphy, and more silence than most people could tolerate. And 3 days before my sister's wedding, I almost didn't go home at all. I was standing in my kitchen, staring at the invitation taped to the refrigerator when my phone rang. My mother. I let it ring 4 times before answering. "Hi, Mom." "Oh, good, you picked up." Her voice already sounded nervous. "Your father's been wondering if you're still coming." That made me laugh quietly. Dad wasn't wondering. Dad was hoping I wouldn't. "I bought the plane ticket," I said. "I'll be there Friday." A pause. Then the careful voice she always used around me. "That's good, sweetheart." Sweetheart? My mother started talking to me like I was fragile after my second deployment, like one loud noise might crack me open. She never used to sound afraid of me before the military. Before the newspapers started using words like classified combat operations and decorated service member. Before my divorce. "You'll stay at the house?" she asked. I booked a hotel. Another silence. Your own mother can say 1,000 things without opening her mouth. "You know your father didn't mean..." "Yes," I interrupted softly. "He did." I wasn't angry anymore, not really. That's the thing age does to you, especially after war. Eventually, the pain stops burning and turns cold instead. My father's exact words 6 years earlier still sat inside my memory clear as glass. The war destroyed you. Not hurt you. Not changed you. Destroyed. Like I'd been turned into something broken beyond repair. I'd just returned from my final deployment when he said it. I remember standing in my parents' kitchen wearing civilian clothes that still felt strange on my body. My hands shook back then. I barely slept. Sudden noises made my chest lock tight. Dad looked at me across the dinner table for a long time before finally saying it. "You came back colder than the battlefield." At the time, I honestly thought he was right. By Friday afternoon, I was driving through my hometown outside Richmond with both hands tight on the steering wheel. Everything looked smaller than I remembered. The grocery store where Mom used to buy birthday cakes. The old gas station where my first car died senior year. The diner where my ex-husband proposed 20 years ago before either of us understood what military life actually costs people. I checked into a Marriott near the interstate instead of going straight to my parents' house. Cowardly, maybe. But after years overseas, I'd learned something important about survival. You don't walk willingly into emotional ambushes. That evening was the rehearsal dinner. Emily had chosen a beautiful waterfront restaurant overlooking the James River. White lights wrapped around the railings. Jazz music drifted through open windows. Rich people everywhere. The groom's family had money, serious money. Old Virginia money. Defense contracts, real estate, political connections. Exactly the kind of people my father spent his entire life trying to impress. When I walked inside, conversations lowered almost immediately. Not because anyone recognized me. Because military changes how you move. You stop wandering into rooms casually after enough years scanning exits and reading threats without thinking about it. My younger sister spotted me first. "Claire." Emily hurried over in a pale blue dress worth more than my monthly mortgage payment. She hugged me carefully like she wasn't sure I'd hug back. "You made it." "Would have been hard to miss your 5th reminder text." She smiled awkwardly. "Emily and I used to be close once. Before life split us into different worlds. She became the warm daughter, the easy daughter, the one who married dentists and hosted Christmas brunches and called home every Sunday. I became the daughter people discussed quietly behind closed doors." "How do I look?" she asked. "Nervous." "Thanks." I almost smiled. Almost. Then my father appeared beside us holding a bourbon glass. Harold Walker, 72 years old, broad shoulders gone softer with age but still carrying himself like the loudest man in every room. He looked me up and down. No hug. No welcome home. Just a long stare at the black dress I'd chosen specifically not to attract attention. "You couldn't smile a little tonight?" he asked quietly. There it was. Didn't even take 60 seconds. "I am smiling." "No," he muttered, "you're enduring." Emily immediately stepped between us. "Dad, please." But he kept staring at me. "The Whitmores are important people," he said. "Tonight isn't about you." Funny thing was, I'd spent most of my life trying desperately not to make anything about me. But families create their own stories about people eventually. And once they decide who you are, they stop looking any deeper. My father introduced me to guests all evening like I was some embarrassing side note attached to the family. "This is my older daughter Claire. She was in the military." Was. Never she served her country. Never she sacrificed. Just was. At one point, I overheard one woman whisper to another near the bar. "She looks intimidating." The other woman answered quietly. "She looks sad." That one hit closer. About an hour into dinner, I realized something else. Nobody had saved me a seat at the family table. Not one. I stood there holding my wine glass while servers moved around me and relatives avoided eye contact. Finally, Emily noticed. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Claire, I thought Mom." "It's okay." And honestly, it was. Because humiliation stops hurting so much after combat. Perspective changes permanently once you've watched folded flags handed to grieving mothers. Still, something inside me felt tired. Not angry. Just tired. Later that night, my father cornered me outside near the water before I could leave. The river reflected silver under the lights. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed heavily. "Tomorrow matters," he said. "Emily deserves one perfect day." "She will have one." He studied me carefully. "You know, people get uncomfortable around you." There it was again. The thing nobody says directly. Veterans come home carrying invisible weather inside them. And civilians sense it. "You walk around like you're still over there," he continued quietly. "Like part of you never came home." I looked out across the dark river. He wasn't entirely wrong. Finally, he said the words that stayed with me all night long. "The war destroyed you, Claire." I stood there silently for several seconds. Then I answered the only way I knew how anymore. Calmly. "You should get some sleep, Dad." And I walked away before he could see the look on my face. The next morning I stood in front of the hotel bathroom mirror at 6:30, staring at a woman I barely recognized anymore. Not because I looked old. Because I looked tired in places sleep could never fix. The overhead light caught the faint scar near my jawline, the one people politely pretended not to notice. My dark hair had more silver in it than last year. My shoulders still carried themselves too straight, too alert, even in silence. Military posture. Combat posture. You spend enough years overseas and your body forgets how to relax before your mind does. I adjusted the collar of my charcoal gray suit jacket and looked down at the small velvet box sitting beside the sink. Inside was my Navy Cross. I almost brought it to the wedding. Then I laughed at myself and snapped the box shut again. What kind of person wears medals to her sister's wedding? Besides, my family never cared about medals anyway. To them, military service had always been something abstract and uncomfortable, noble from a distance, inconvenient up close. Especially after I came home carrying pieces of war they couldn't understand. By 8:30, I was driving toward Whitmore Country Club under a pale Virginia sky. The roads were lined with old oak trees dripping Spanish moss, beautiful in the kind of quiet southern way tourists love. The country club itself looked like something out of an old political drama. White columns, massive fountains, valets in pressed uniforms guiding luxury cars into perfect lines. Money everywhere. The kind of money that smells like old leather chairs and private golf memberships. I parked at the far end of the lot on purpose. Less attention that way. Inside the ballroom buzzed with soft piano music and expensive conversations. Women in designer dresses floated between tables carrying champagne flutes. Men with silver hair discussed investments and defense contracts near the bar. I immediately felt the shift that always happens in rooms like that. People noticing me without understanding why. Not fear exactly. Instinct. A man near the entrance glanced at my hands, my posture, the way my eyes automatically tracked exits. Then he quietly stepped aside without realizing he'd done it. Combat veterans recognize each other even out of uniform. Sometimes civilians do too. Emily spotted me near the ballroom doors and hurried over. She looked beautiful. Really beautiful. Not just because of the dress, because she was happy. For a second I saw the little girl who used to crawl into my room during thunderstorms. "You came," she said softly. "Pretty sure weddings require that." She smiled nervously, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her dress. "You look nice." "So do you." "You could have worn a dress, though." There it was. Even today. I glanced down at my tailored suit. "It's a wedding, not a beauty pageant." Emily sighed quietly. "Claire, just try today, okay?" "Try what?" "Not scaring people." I looked at her for a long moment. Then I nodded once. Because arguing before a wedding helps nobody. A few minutes later, my mother rushed over, already flustered. "Claire, sweetheart, thank God." She grabbed my arm. "The seating cards got mixed up last night, but we fixed everything." "Of course they did." "Now." Mom adjusted my jacket gently. "You look thin." "You've said that every year since 2008. "That's because it's true." Her eyes softened suddenly. "You sleeping any better?" I hesitated. "Sometimes." She nodded like that answer hurt her. Before she could say more, my father appeared beside us wearing a navy tuxedo, and the same expression he always wore around wealthy people, desperate confidence. "Claire," he said sharply, "come meet the Whitmores." "Not would you like to?" "Just come." I followed him across the ballroom toward a cluster of elegantly dressed guests near the windows. As we walked, Dad leaned closer. "Please try not to be intense today." I almost laughed. Intense. You know what I mean. Actually, I didn't. But after years of these conversations, I'd learned asking only made things worse. The Whitmores looked exactly like old Virginia wealth usually looks. Conservative elegance, controlled smiles, expensive watches hidden beneath polite manners. Richard Whitmore stood at the center of the group, speaking with two older men about defense manufacturing. Tall, silver-haired, maybe late 60s. The groom Daniel noticed us first. "Mr. Walker," he said warmly. Dad immediately transformed into a different man entirely. Bigger smile, louder laugh. "Daniel, wonderful ceremony." Hasn't happened yet, I thought. But he was nervous enough to forget that. Then Dad placed a hand lightly against my back. "And this," he announced, "is my older daughter, Claire." There was the brief, awkward pause I'd grown used to over the years. People trying to figure me out. Dad filled the silence quickly. "She served in the military for a while." For a while. 15 years. 3 deployments. 2 classified commendations. 1 divorce. Several funerals. But sure. For a while. One older woman smiled tightly at me. "Oh goodness, Army. Navy. How interesting," she tilted her head. "You certainly carry yourself differently." Before I could answer, another guest chuckled lightly. "She looks like she could kill somebody." A few people laughed politely. I didn't. "Only when necessary," I said calmly. Silence. You could practically hear Emily cringing from across the room. Dad shot me a frustrated look. "See," that look said, "this is exactly what I mean." Richard Whitmore finally turned toward me fully then. At first, his expression remained polite and distracted. Then his eyes dropped briefly to my wrist. The small trident tattoo barely visible beneath my sleeve. Everything changed instantly. I watched the color drain from his face in real time. His mouth parted slightly. Not theatrical. Not exaggerated. Genuine shock. No, he whispered quietly. Dad frowned. Richard. But Richard kept staring at me like he'd opened a door to something he never expected to find standing there. His eyes narrowed slightly. Studying me. Remembering. I knew that look. I'd seen it before from retired officers and old intelligence men who recognized ghosts from classified briefings. You, he said slowly. The room grew strangely quiet around us. My stomach tightened. Not fear. Just exhaustion. I suddenly understood exactly where this conversation was heading, and I wanted no part of it. I stepped back politely. Excuse me, I said. But Richard moved closer instead. Commander Claire Walker. I froze. Not because he knew my name. Because he knew the rank. My father stared between us in confusion. Wait, Dad said awkwardly. You two know each other. Richard never took his eyes off me. No, he answered softly. But I know who she is. Every nerve in my body wanted to leave immediately. Not because I was ashamed. Because I hated this part. The staring. The mythology people build around war. The way civilians mistake survival for something glamorous. Sir, I said quietly, today is Emily's wedding. Meaning, please stop. Richard swallowed hard. Then he said words that turned the entire ballroom cold. Holy God. His voice trembled slightly. She's the Reaper widow. Nobody around us moved. My father blinked. The what? Richard looked at him in disbelief. You seriously don't know? And for the first time in my entire life, I watched my father become the smallest man in the room. Nobody spoke for several seconds after Richard Whitmore said the words. She's the Reaper widow. The ballroom seemed to shrink around me. I could hear silverware clinking faintly somewhere near the back of the room. A champagne cork popped in another corner. Normal wedding sounds continuing while the air around our little group turned painfully still. My father gave a short, nervous laugh. The Reaper what? Richard kept staring at me. Not with admiration. That's the part civilians never understand. Men who truly know war rarely romanticize it. Especially older men. Especially the ones who spent years around special operations personnel after 9/11. Richard looked unsettled, like a memory had just walked back into his life wearing civilian clothes. You honestly don't know who your daughter is? He asked quietly. Dad straightened a little. I know perfectly well who my daughter is. Do you? I almost said it out loud. Instead, I reached for a passing champagne glass from a server's tray and took a slow sip. Emily appeared beside us looking panicked. What's happening? Nothing, I said immediately. But Richard ignored me. I worked with Naval Special Warfare Procurement for years, he explained, still staring at me. There were stories. I closed my eyes briefly. Stories? That word again. War turns real human beings into stories for people far away from it. There's no need for this, I said calmly. Richard nodded once. You're right. But he still couldn't stop looking at me. The groom Daniel glanced between everyone awkwardly. Dad. Richard rubbed one hand across his mouth. I just never thought I'd see her standing at a wedding reception. There it was. Her. Not Claire. Not Commander Walker. Her. Like I was some classified rumor people whispered about over bourbon after Pentagon meetings. My father's face hardened slightly. Richard, he said carefully, I think there's been some misunderstanding here. Claire was in the Navy, yes, but she pulled men out of Kandahar during the Black Ridge operation. The words hit me like cold rain. Not because they were classified anymore. Most of that mission had eventually been buried beneath enough paperwork and redactions that pieces leaked through military circles over the years. But because I hadn't heard that mission name spoken aloud in over a decade. Black Ridge. Jesus. I could suddenly smell dust and smoke again. Hear rotor blades. Screaming over comms. I stared into my champagne glass. Sir, I said quietly, please. Richard immediately stopped. Good men recognize pain when they see it. Unfortunately, my father still looked confused instead. Kandahar, he repeated. Claire, what is he talking about? I met his eyes finally. You really want to do this here? That shut him up. Nearby guests had started pretending not to listen while listening to every word. Wealthy people are excellent at that skill. Emily touched my arm gently. Claire, what's Black Ridge? Her voice sounded small. I looked at my little sister standing there in her white wedding gown, and for a moment all I saw was the 16-year-old girl who cried when I left for boot camp. I never wanted her carrying images of war in her head. That's not important today. But Richard spoke softly. It's important because your family clearly spent years misunderstanding what happened to her. My father's jaw tightened. With all due respect, Richard, family matters are private. Richard gave a quiet, humorless laugh. You called her damaged 5 minutes ago. Dad froze. So did I. Apparently Richard had overheard more than I realized earlier. You said the war destroyed her, Richard continued. Do you have any idea what your daughter actually survived? My father looked embarrassed now. And angry. The dangerous combination proud men reach when humiliation starts cracking their ego. She came home different, Dad snapped. Colder, distant. Her marriage fell apart. She stopped talking to people. Because she went to war, Richard replied sharply. The room went silent again. Not dramatic silence. Heavy silence. The kind older people understand well. The silence that comes right before someone is forced to confront an ugly truth. I could see Emily beginning to shake slightly. Claire, she whispered what happened over there. I looked away toward the ballroom windows. Outside sunlight reflected beautifully across the golf course lake. Peaceful. Safe. Nothing like Afghanistan. I lost people, I said simply. Dad crossed his arms. Everyone loses people. I turned toward him slowly. And for the first time all weekend, something inside me cracked open. Not like that. My voice stayed calm. That almost made it worse. I watched 22-year-old boys bleed out asking for their mothers. I continued quietly. I zipped friends into bags, Dad. I wrote letters to wives explaining why their husbands weren't coming home. Nobody moved. You think I came back cold? I asked. I came back carrying ghosts. Emily suddenly covered her mouth. My mother looked near tears. But my father still looked defensive because some men mistake vulnerability for accusation. I didn't know, he muttered. I almost laughed. How could you not know? Then again, I never told them much. Classified work becomes a wall eventually. You stop explaining because you physically can't explain. And after a while, silence becomes habit. Richard spoke carefully now. There were men who credited her with saving entire extraction teams. Dad stared at him. My daughter wasn't SEAL Team 6. No, Richard answered softly. She was worse. That actually earned the faintest smile from me. Old special operations humor. Richard stepped closer. Do you know why they called her the Reaper Widow? I immediately shook my head. Please don't. But Emily whispered. Why? Richard hesitated, then answered quietly. Because she was usually the one bringing the dead home. I closed my eyes. There it was. The ugliest truth underneath every military nickname. Nothing glamorous. Nothing cinematic. Just grief. Mission after mission, casualty after casualty, I somehow survived while others didn't. Somebody started calling me widow after my third extraction operation involving fatalities. Then Reaper got added later by operators who thought dark humor made death easier to carry. It didn't. Dad looked physically ill now. You were bringing bodies home. I nodded once. That was part of it. Oh my God, my mother whispered. And suddenly I realized something painful. My family had spent 15 years imagining me as emotionally broken, without ever once asking what broke me. At that exact moment, another voice suddenly cut across the ballroom behind us. Commander Walker. I turned immediately. An elderly man stood near the reception tables wearing a dark suit with a navy pin attached to his lapel. Rear Admiral Thomas Reed, retired. I hadn't seen him since 2014. Even in his 70s, the man still carried himself like command authority wrapped in steel. The second our eyes met, he straightened instinctively. And before anyone in the ballroom fully understood what was happening, the Admiral saluted me. Every veteran in the room noticed instantly. Several older men rose from their chairs automatically. My father stared in disbelief. But the worst part, it wasn't the salute. It was the expression on the Admiral's face afterward. Not fear. Not awe. Respect. The kind my own father had never once shown me. After Admiral Reed saluted me, the ballroom never quite recovered. The music continued. People still smiled for photographs. Champagne still flowed from silver trays carried by nervous-looking servers. But the atmosphere had changed completely. You could feel it, like a pressure system rolling through a quiet town before a storm finally breaks. The veterans in the room kept glancing toward me now, some with curiosity, some with recognition, some with the uncomfortable understanding older servicemen carry when they realize another person has seen too much. Meanwhile, my father looked like a man who'd accidentally walked into the wrong church halfway through confession. Admiral Reed lowered his salute slowly and approached me with the careful stiffness age gives retired officers. "Claire," he said warmly, "didn't know you were stateside. Been retired almost 2 years now." He nodded. "You look tired." I smiled faintly. "You too, sir." That actually made him laugh. Around us, guests pretended not to stare. Emily stepped closer carefully. "You know an admiral." Before I could answer, Reed looked directly at her. "Your sister saved American lives overseas." Simple. Direct. No theatrics. And somehow that landed harder than anything Richard Whitmore had said. Emily's eyes immediately filled with tears. My father still looked stunned. "You never told us any of this." I finally turned toward him fully. "You never asked." That one hurt him. I saw it immediately. Good. Not because I wanted revenge exactly. At 38, revenge feels less satisfying than younger people imagine. Mostly you just want acknowledgement. Truth. Maybe dignity. My mother quietly touched Dad's arm. "Harold?" But he kept staring at me. "You were really involved in all that." All that. Funny phrase. As if war were some messy side project I forgot to mention. I looked across the ballroom toward the massive windows overlooking the golf course. Then I answered honestly. Yes. No details. No dramatic stories. Just yes. Because there are memories veterans learn to keep locked down if they want to survive civilian life. Unfortunately, Richard Whitmore chose that exact moment to continue talking. "You know," he said quietly to Dad, "there were people in D.C. who thought your daughter should have received the Medal of Honor." I closed my eyes briefly. Jesus Christ. Richard I warned softly. But older men with guilt sometimes keep talking because silence suddenly feels cowardly. She ran extraction under direct fire 3 separate times during Black Ridge. Emily whispered. "What does that mean?" Nobody answered immediately. Finally, Admiral Reed spoke. "It means other people were retreating," he said carefully, "and your sister went back in." The ballroom felt smaller by the second. I hated this. Not because the stories embarrassed me. Because dead people deserve privacy too. Every military hero story is built on somebody else's funeral. Dad looked shaken now. "Claire." I cut him off gently. "Can we please stop discussing Afghanistan at Emily's wedding?" Thank God Emily finally stepped forward. "She's right." Her voice cracked slightly. "This isn't about war." For a moment I thought the situation might finally settle down. Then one of the older guests near the bar approached slowly. Marine Corps veteran by the posture, mid-70s. He looked at me carefully before speaking. "My grandson served in Helmand Province," he said quietly. "He used to talk about a woman called Widow." My chest tightened immediately. The old man swallowed hard. "He came home because of her." I looked down at my hands. "Sir?" "He killed himself 3 years later," the man continued softly. "But he made it home first." That one almost broke me. Because that's the part civilians rarely understand about modern war. Getting soldiers home alive doesn't always save them. Sometimes the battlefield follows them back. The old Marine gently squeezed my shoulder once before walking away. And suddenly the ballroom noise felt very far away. I needed air. Without another word, I stepped outside through the side doors overlooking the water behind the country club. The October breeze felt cool against my face. For several minutes I just stood there alone, listening to distant laughter drift from inside. Weddings are strange after war. Too much happiness in one room can make damaged people feel like intruders. A few minutes later, the doors opened quietly behind me. Emily, still wearing her wedding gown. Still carrying that worried little girl expression she'd had since childhood. "You disappeared." I needed a minute. She nodded slowly and stepped beside me, overlooking the lake. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she finally whispered, "Were you really that famous?" I laughed softly. Famous. God. Number. But they looked terrified. Not terrified. I paused. Careful. Emily wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. Dad always said the military changed you. It did. But not like this. There it was again. The realization slowly hitting her. For years, my family had reduced everything complicated about me into one simple explanation. Claire became difficult. Claire became cold. Claire became distant. None of them had ever stopped to ask why. Emily's voice grew smaller. Were you scared over there? That question nearly undid me more than all the military talk inside. Because she sounded like my baby sister again. Not a bride. Not an adult woman. Just Emily. I stared out across the dark water. Every day. She looked shocked. You. I almost smiled. Especially me. Fear keeps people alive. The fearless ones usually come home in flag-draped coffins. I thought special operators weren't afraid. That's movie nonsense. I glanced toward her. The brave people are usually terrified. They just keep moving anyway. Emily wiped at her eyes carefully. I'm sorry. For what? For believing Dad. That hit deeper than she realized. I leaned against the railing quietly. Your whole life they compared us differently, she continued. You were the difficult daughter. I was the easy one. You were never easy, I said dryly. That made her laugh through tears. Then her expression turned serious again. When you came home after deployments, I didn't know how to talk to you anymore. Neither did I. That was the truth nobody says out loud about veterans returning home. Families expect reunions. What they actually get are strangers trying to recognize each other again. I thought maybe you stopped loving us, Emily whispered. I looked at her sharply. Number. Then why'd you stay away so long? Because it was easier. Because silence feels safer than disappointing people. Because once civilians decide you're damaged, eventually you start believing them. But I couldn't say any of that out loud. Before I answered, the doors behind us opened again. This time it was Dad. He looked older than he had yesterday. Older than he had that morning even. For several seconds he simply stood there staring at us. Then his eyes settled on me. I need to ask you something, he said quietly. I already knew the question before he spoke it. How many men died under your command? The wind moved softly across the lake. And for the first time since returning home, I saw genuine fear in my father's eyes. Not fear of me. Fear for me. My father stood across from me beside the lake, waiting for an answer neither of us truly wanted to hear. Behind him, warm golden light spilled from the ballroom windows. I could still hear muffled music drifting through the glass. Somewhere inside, guests were laughing politely over wedding cake and expensive bourbon. But out there by the water, none of that mattered anymore. How many men died under your command, he repeated quietly. Emily inhaled sharply beside me. I looked at my father for a long moment before answering. I stopped counting. The truth landed harder than any dramatic number could have. Dad's face tightened. Not judgment this time. Pain. I think that was the moment he finally understood war isn't measured by medals or headlines. It's measured by names you carry forever. I didn't know he whispered again. This time I believed him. Because people my father's age grew up in a different America. A quieter America. Soldiers came home from Vietnam broken in ways nobody knew how to discuss, so entire generations learned to avoid uncomfortable conversations altogether. Men buried pain. Women carried families. And trauma sat silently at dinner tables for decades. Dad took a slow breath. When you were little, he said carefully, you used to cry if birds hit the windows outside. I smiled faintly despite myself. I remember. You buried a dead squirrel in the backyard when you were 9 because you didn't want it left alone. Emily laughed softly through tears. Oh my God, I forgot about that. Dad stared at me. I can't reconcile that little girl with what? He looked away toward the dark lake. With someone people call Reaper Widow. There it was. The thing haunting him. The nickname. not understanding how war could turn a gentle child into something whispered about by hardened military men. I leaned against the railing slowly. It didn't turn me into something else, I said. It forced me to survive things. Dad rubbed both hands over his face tiredly. That's worse. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then Emily quietly asked, "What really happened in Afghanistan?" I closed my eyes briefly. Some memories age like rusted metal. Touch them years later and they still cut. But for the first time in my life, my family wasn't asking out of curiosity. They were asking because they finally wanted to understand me. So I answered. Black Ridge was supposed to be a simple extraction, I said quietly. Intel went bad. Even now my voice automatically flattened into operational calm whenever discussing combat. Training never leaves completely. A SEAL reconnaissance team got trapped inside a valley compound after insurgents intercepted their route. They were outnumbered and cut off. Emily looked pale already. Dad listened silently. We lost air support because of a sandstorm. Communications kept dropping. Nobody could get to them. I stared out at the water. But somebody had to try. The October wind carried distant laughter from inside the ballroom. Funny how life keeps moving while people describe the worst moments they've ever lived through. We got there too late for some of them, I continued quietly. My father swallowed hard. How old were they? Most 23, 24. Jesus. The expression on Dad's face shifted immediately. Because suddenly those weren't soldiers anymore. They were boys. Somebody's sons. 2 operators were still alive when we reached the compound, I said. One had lost most of his leg. The other was burned badly enough he couldn't see. Emily covered her mouth. I kept going anyway. Extraction helicopters couldn't land under fire, so we had to carry them nearly 2 miles through the ridgeline. Dad's voice sounded strained now. And you went back? I nodded once. 3 times. Why? That question nearly made me laugh. Because soldiers over 60 usually understand the answer instinctively. You go back because somebody would have gone back for you. That's what we do, I said simply. Dad stared at me like he was trying to rebuild his understanding of his own daughter piece by piece. What about the others? He asked carefully. I looked down. We brought everybody home. Silence settled again. Heavy silence. The kind older Americans know well. The kind built from funerals, regrets, and things people wish they'd said sooner. Finally, Emily whispered. And after that, you were different. I almost smiled sadly. Number. I looked at her. I was already changing long before that. Because war doesn't destroy people all at once. It happens slowly. Conversation by conversation. Funeral by funeral. You lose the ability to explain ordinary life to yourself. Then eventually you lose the ability to explain yourself to ordinary people. Dad sat down heavily on a nearby bench overlooking the lake. For the first time in my entire life he looked small to me. Not weak. Just human. I thought you stopped caring about this family, he admitted quietly. That one hurt more than I expected. I stopped knowing how to fit into it. He nodded slowly like the answer made terrible sense. You'd come home and sit there silently during Christmas dinner, he said. You'd stare at doors, windows, crowds. I was checking exits, even around us. Yes. The word came out before I could soften it. Dad looked devastated. And suddenly I regretted saying it. Not because it wasn't true. Because parents aren't built to hear their children describe living in survival mode. I thought you were judging us, he said quietly. Number. I sat beside him. I was trying to calm my nervous system enough to feel safe indoors. That finally broke something in him. My father lowered his head into his hands. Oh God. I'd seen men cry in combat zones before. Usually older men. Usually after the danger passed. This looked exactly the same. I failed you, he whispered. I immediately shook my head. Number. Yes. His voice cracked sharply. You came home carrying all that, and all I could think about was how uncomfortable you made people. Emily started crying openly now. I thought if I pushed you hard enough, Dad continued, you'd become normal again. Normal. That impossible word veterans spend years chasing. I stared across the lake quietly. There's no going back after some things, I said softly. Dad looked at me with tears in his eyes. Then he asked the question that mattered most. Did anybody ever help you carry it? I thought about that for a long time. The truth surprised even me. Not really. That answer seemed to physically wound him. Inside the ballroom, the DJ announced the father-daughter dance. Emily wiped her face quickly. That's our cue. Dad stood slowly, but before heading inside, he turned toward me again. His voice sounded older than I'd ever heard it. I spent 15 years believing the war destroyed my daughter. He swallowed hard. But maybe it was the silence afterward that did the real damage. And for the first time since coming home, my father finally saw me clearly. The wedding ended later than expected. By the time the final guests drifted toward the valet stand and the ballroom lights dimmed low, the October air had turned cold enough to fog the windows. I was standing alone near the parking lot watching leaves scrape across the pavement when I heard footsteps behind me. My father. For a second, neither of us spoke. He looked exhausted. Not physically. Spiritually. Like a man who'd spent an entire day discovering how wrong he'd been about someone he loved. You leaving? He asked quietly. Probably best. He nodded once, though he clearly hated the answer. The valet station lights reflected across his tired face. I suddenly noticed how old he'd become. The deep lines around his mouth. The slight stiffness in his shoulders. War ages soldiers. Regret ages parents. I used to brag about you when you were little, he said unexpectedly. I glanced at him. You did? All the time. A faint smile crossed his face. You climbed everything, trees, roofs, that terrible swing set I built. I laughed softly. You fell off the garage once. You told me not to cry because astronauts probably fell worse than that. That earned a real smile from me. Small, but real. Dad looked down at the pavement. Then somewhere along the line, I stopped understanding you. The wind moved quietly through the dark trees around the country club. I didn't know how to talk to the version of you that came home, he admitted. Neither did I. That was the tragedy underneath so many American families after war. People expect soldiers to return exactly the same, then panic when they don't. Dad shoved his hands into his coat pockets. When your marriage ended, he paused carefully, I blamed you. I looked away toward the empty parking lot. I know. He came to me one night after you deployed again. Dad's voice sounded ashamed now. Your ex-husband said he felt like he was living with somebody who never fully unpacked her bags. I closed my eyes briefly. David. Jesus. There are some wounds age never fully dulls. He said you stopped sleeping beside him, Dad continued quietly. Stopped laughing. Stopped talking. I stopped sleeping at all. Dad swallowed hard. I should have realized something was wrong. I stared out into the dark. You know the strange thing, I said softly. I kept waiting for somebody to ask me if I was okay. That one nearly broke him again. Because parents hear every version of their failures eventually. Some just arrive later in life. A car door slammed somewhere across the parking lot. Then silence returned. I thought strength meant handling things yourself, Dad admitted. That's how your generation survived. He nodded slowly. That's also how we destroyed ourselves. For several moments we simply stood there together beneath the yellow parking lot lights. Not fixing 15 years? Just finally telling the truth about them. Then Dad looked at me carefully. Why didn't you ever tell us how bad it was? I smiled sadly. Because every time I tried, people looked horrified. That was the reality nobody prepares veterans for. Civilians love the idea of sacrifice. Until sacrifice starts describing real things. Real blood. Real nightmares. Real funerals. You stopped asking after a while, I continued. Mom got nervous whenever Afghanistan came up. Emily changed the subject. You got angry. Dad stared at the ground. I thought talking about it would make things worse. Silence made things worse. The words settled heavily between us. Inside the building, staff members were clearing tables and shutting down the reception. The wedding was over. But something else had finally begun. Dad looked toward the ballroom doors. Come inside one more time. I don't think that's necessary. It is. His tone surprised me. Not commanding. Certain. A few minutes later, we walked back into the nearly empty ballroom together. Only close family remained now. My mother, Emily and Daniel, A few relatives gathering coats near the exits. Conversation stopped immediately when they saw us. Dad moved slowly toward the center of the room. Then he did something I never expected to see for the rest of my life. He cleared his throat nervously and addressed the room. "I need to say something." Emily looked confused. Mom already seemed emotional again. Dad turned toward me fully. "When Claire came home from the military, I thought the war had destroyed my daughter." The room went completely silent. "But tonight I realized something." His voice cracked slightly. "The war didn't destroy her." He swallowed hard. "It revealed how weak the rest of us were." I immediately shook my head. "Dad." "Number." For the first time in years, he interrupted me gently instead of dismissively. "I spent 15 years punishing you for surviving things I couldn't even imagine." Tears filled my mother's eyes. Emily was openly crying again beside Daniel. Dad kept going anyway. "You came home carrying grief, trauma, guilt, and instead of helping you carry it, I treated you like an embarrassment." The room felt painfully still. "I kept saying the military made you cold." His voice broke completely now. "But maybe you were just exhausted from carrying pain alone." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And suddenly I realized something shocking. My father had been carrying shame too. Not because of me. Because deep down he knew he'd abandoned his daughter emotionally when she needed him most. He stepped closer carefully. "I am so sorry, Claire." Not polished. Not dramatic. Just honest. And somehow honesty hits harder after 60 than pride ever does. I looked at him for a long time. Then I saw it. Not the stubborn businessman. Not the critical father. Just an aging man terrified he'd run out of time to repair his family. Emily suddenly crossed the room and hugged me tightly. For years, physical affection between us had felt awkward and forced. Not this time. "I'm sorry too," she whispered through tears. "I should have tried harder." I hugged her back carefully. Then my mother joined us. Then somehow all four of us ended up standing there together in the middle of a half-empty ballroom, holding onto each other like survivors after a storm. Even Daniel looked emotional. Richard Whitmore watched quietly from across the room before finally approaching me one last time. "You know," he said softly, "there are men in Washington who still talk about you like a ghost story." I shook my head faintly. "They should talk about the ones who didn't come home." Richard nodded immediately. "That's exactly why they respect you." For once, I didn't argue. Several weeks later, I was still in Virginia. Longer than I'd stayed in years. Dad started attending counseling sessions for military families at the local Veterans Center after Emily pushed him into going. Turns out he wasn't alone. Room after room filled with aging parents, spouses, and children quietly admitting the same thing. We didn't know how to bring them home. Neither did the veterans. That was the heartbreaking part. We were all improvising. One Saturday morning, Dad and I sat on his back porch drinking coffee while autumn leaves drifted across the yard. Peaceful. Ordinary. The kind of morning I used to think I'd never deserve again. "You know," Dad said quietly, "you finally seem lighter." I looked out toward the trees. Maybe because somebody's helping me carry it now. He nodded slowly. Then, after a long silence, he said the words I'd waited years to hear. "I'm proud of you, Claire. Not for medals. Not for combat. For surviving." And strangely enough, that mattered more. If this story touched you in some way, maybe take a moment tonight to call someone who came home different. A veteran, a spouse, a parent. Sometimes people don't need perfect words. They just need to know they were never carrying it alone. And if you believe stories about healing family and second chances still matter, don't forget to share, subscribe, and spend a little more time listening to the quiet people in your life. Sometimes silence is where the deepest battles are hiding. The first thing my father said after I answered the phone was, "The bank's taking the house. What did you do?" His voice was sharp with panic, stripped of the cold authority he had used on me my whole life. In the background, I could hear my mother crying. Papers rustled. A television blared somewhere in the house. I remember smiling. Not because I was happy. Not because revenge had ever been something I dreamed about. But because for the first time in 42 years, Frank Reeves sounded afraid, and I wasn't the one standing there shaking. I quietly ended the call. Then I looked through the window of my motel room at the gray Virginia morning and let myself remember how all of it had started. It had begun exactly 1 week earlier. At 5:03 on a Monday morning, someone started pounding on my apartment door hard enough to rattle the brass unit number screwed into the frame. I woke instantly. 20 years in Army intelligence teaches you to wake fast. For a moment I thought I was back in Afghanistan, half asleep in a plywood bunk, while incoming alarms screamed through the dark. My heart slammed against my ribs before my mind caught up with where I was. Fort Belvoir, Virginia. Officer housing. Stateside. Safe. Then the pounding came again. Major Reeves Military Police, open the door. I was already out of bed, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. My apartment was neat, everything exactly where it belonged. Habit, discipline, order had shaped my life for more than 2 decades. I threw on a robe and opened the door. 2 MPs stood there in full uniform. Behind them was a man in civilian clothes holding a leather folder. The older MP avoided my eyes. That was my first warning. The civilian introduced himself as Special Agent Thomas Keating with Army Criminal Investigation Division. Major Abigail Reeves, he said, his voice clipped and formal, you are being placed under immediate administrative suspension, pending investigation into unauthorized access and transfer of classified financial intelligence records. For a moment the words didn't register. Unauthorized access. Transfer. I stared at him. There has to be some mistake. I'm afraid not. He handed me papers. Legal language blurred across the page. My security clearance was suspended effective immediately. My command authority was revoked pending investigation. I was prohibited from entering secure facilities or accessing military systems. It felt unreal, like hearing details from someone else's life. I had spent 21 years building my career. West Point. 2 overseas tours? Bronze Star. Countless nights under fluorescent lights tracking financial trails through hostile networks. And now some stranger was standing in my doorway dismantling all of it before sunrise. I want my JAG representative. You'll have one by 800. The younger MP shifted uncomfortably. He knew me. I recognized him too, Private Morales, fresh-faced kid from Texas. I'd once helped him get emergency leave when his father had a stroke. Now he stood there while another man confiscated my government-issued laptop and credentials. That was how quickly dignity can vanish. By 6:30, the rumors had already started. Military communities are small. News moves faster than wildfire. By 7, I had 3 texts from officers asking if the allegations were true. By 8, silence. No one wants proximity to disgrace. I sat in my apartment until 10, staring at my blank television screen. Then I did the one thing I hadn't done in years. I drove to my parents' house. They lived in Columbia, Maryland, in the same neat colonial home where I'd grown up. White shutters, blue hydrangeas, American flag hanging proudly from the porch. Frank Reeves believed deeply in appearances. A polished lawn meant discipline. Pressed shirts meant respectability. Children who succeeded reflected well on their parents. Children who stumbled were an embarrassment to be corrected. I had spent most of my life trying to earn his approval. Even West Point hadn't fully done it. He'd shaken my hand at graduation and said, "Not bad." That was the closest thing to pride I'd ever received. I pulled into their driveway just after noon. For a second, sitting there with my hands gripping the wheel, I was 16 again, hoping home would feel safe. I rang the bell. My mother answered. Elaine Reeves looked smaller than I remembered, softer somehow, her silver hair pinned neatly back. The moment she saw my face, her expression changed. Fear. Not concern. Fear. "Abby." "Mom, I need to talk to Dad." She hesitated. Then my father appeared behind her. Frank Reeves looked exactly as he always had, straight-backed iron gray hair, crisp button-down shirt tucked neatly into pressed slacks. Even retired, he dressed like the world was watching. His eyes landed on me, then narrowed. I saw the news. It isn't true. Military police don't show up for innocent people. I stared at him. "Dad, I'm being framed." He folded his arms. "You've brought enough shame to this family." The words landed harder than I expected. My mother looked down. Not defending me. Not saying my name. Just looking down. Then my father said the sentence I will never forget. "Don't drag our family name down with you." I laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. "Are you serious?" Without answering, he stepped outside and dropped my old deployment duffel bag onto the porch. I stared at it. "What is this?" "We cleared out the things you left here." Confusion hit me first. Then dread. I reached for my phone and opened my banking app. Balance $413.72. I froze. Number. No. The account had held nearly $80,000. Savings from deployments. Combat pay. Years of careful planning for retirement. My father had co-signed emergency access years ago before my first deployment in case something happened overseas. I looked up at him, my pulse roaring in my ears. "You emptied my account." "We protected family assets from seizure." My mouth went dry. That was my money. It was under our family name. Then he looked me straight in the eye and said, calm, as if discussing weather, "Never use our family name again." My mother began crying quietly behind him. But she said nothing. And somehow that hurt more. I picked up my duffel. No shouting. No pleading. Military training teaches control. So I turned and walked back to my car. I drove south until Maryland disappeared in the rearview mirror. By nightfall, I checked into a roadside motel off I-95 with faded floral bedspreads and humming fluorescent lights. And for the first time since I was 18 years old, I had nowhere to go. That was the night I realized something harder than betrayal. Sometimes the people who abandon you were never really standing with you at all. The motel room smelled faintly of bleach and stale cigarette smoke. That smell stayed with me all week. Even now, months later, I sometimes catch a trace of disinfectant in a hospital hallway or an airport restroom, and I'm right back there sitting on the edge of that sagging mattress with my army duffel at my feet, staring at a future that had gone blank overnight. The first morning after my parents threw me out, I woke before dawn out of habit. For 21 years, Reveille had been my clock, whether I was stationed in Virginia, South Korea, or halfway across a desert under blackout conditions. My body still expected purpose at 0500. Instead, there was only silence. No command schedule. No secure briefings. No morning reports waiting in my inbox. Just the buzz of the motel's ancient air conditioner and the sick feeling that my life had been paused by someone else's hand. I sat up slowly and reached for my phone. Nothing. No messages from command. No texts from colleagues. No calls from my parents. The isolation felt surgical, as if every thread connecting me to the world had been cut cleanly at once. For a while, I simply sat there and listened to the traffic passing on Interstate 95 beyond the window. Then discipline took over. I showered. Pressed my civilian clothes as neatly as I could. Made the bed. Small things. Order is often the only defense against panic. At 800 sharp, my temporary legal liaison called. Captain Laura Kim, Judge Advocate General's Corps. Her voice was professional but kind. "Major Reeves, I've reviewed the preliminary allegations." And a pause. "This is unusual." That got my attention. How unusual. The access logs show your credentials authorized financial intelligence transfers at 0217 hours last Thursday. I was asleep in my quarters. "I know, base access logs confirm you never left your apartment." A quiet tension entered her voice. Someone either cloned your credentials or they had elevated system override access. I sat straighter. Which means this wasn't random. Number. For the first time since the MPS had appeared at my door, my fear sharpened into focus. I had spent years tracking financial fraud through military contracting systems. If someone had used my credentials to move classified financial records, they either wanted money or they wanted me blamed for finding something I shouldn't have. Laura's voice lowered. Officially, I shouldn't say more, but unofficially, Major, this smells wrong. After we hung up, I stared at the wall for a long time. Then I opened my notebook. Paper, pen, old school. When systems are compromised, analog survives. I began writing every case I'd touched in the last 6 months. Defense vendors. Logistics contractors. Supply chain discrepancies. Payment irregularities. Halfway down page 3, one name stopped me cold. Redstone Federal Logistics. 3 months earlier, I had flagged unusual transaction layering through their overseas subcontractors. Nothing dramatic at first glance, just enough inconsistency to suggest laundering if someone knew where to look. I had submitted a recommendation for expanded audit review. 2 days later, I'd been told higher command would handle it. Then silence. Now I was under investigation. My instincts stirred. This wasn't coincidence. At noon, there was a knock at my motel door. Every muscle tightened. When I opened it, Colonel Daniel Mercer stood there holding 2 coffees. Retired 3 years now, Mercer had once been my commanding officer and the closest thing I'd ever had to a professional father. Tall and broad even in his 60s, with silver hair cropped short and eyes that missed nothing, he looked exactly as he had the day he pinned my oak leaves on my uniform. "You look terrible," he said. I almost laughed. That obvious? Abigail, I've interrogated cartel financiers with better posture. That made me smile despite myself. He handed me coffee and stepped inside. We sat by the window while morning traffic hissed past outside. He listened while I told him everything. The MPs. My parents. The missing money. Redstone. When I finished, he was quiet. Then he nodded slowly. I was afraid of this. My stomach tightened. You know something? Not enough to prove anything. He folded his hands. 3 weeks ago, a friend at the Pentagon called me. Internal oversight had concerns about procurement fraud tied to Redstone and several shell contractors. I felt my pulse quicken. How high does it go? High enough that if you got close to exposing it, someone would notice. The room felt smaller. You think I was set up? I think someone with system-level access used your credentials because they knew your audit flags would make you believable. He leaned forward. Listen carefully, Abigail. Truth in Washington moves slow, but it always leaves footprints. That sentence settled into me like an anchor. For the first time all week, I could breathe. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't disgraced. I was inconvenient. And inconvenient people get erased if they stop paying attention. After Mercer left, I worked. Not officially. Not on any military system. But I knew enough about contractor reporting structures to map likely shell pathways by hand. Hours passed. Outside daylight faded to dusk. Around 7, my phone buzzed. Dad. I stared at his name. Frank Reeves had not called once to ask if I was safe. Not once. Now his name glowed across my screen like a command. I let it ring out. A minute later, voicemail. Then another call. Another voicemail. By midnight, there were 6. I didn't listen. Not yet. Instead, I sat by the motel window and watched headlights sweep across the parking lot. Somewhere out there, powerful people thought they had buried me. At the same time, somewhere north in Maryland, my father was calling with growing urgency. For reasons I didn't yet understand, both sides had suddenly remembered I existed. And experience had taught me one thing. When people who've ignored you suddenly need your attention, the truth is usually about to surface. I slept with my notebook open beside me. And for the first time since military police had pounded on my door, I dreamed not of losing everything, but of getting it back. The 7th call came at 6:14 the next morning. I was already awake, sitting at the little motel desk with my notebook open and a stale cup of coffee cooling beside me. Dawn was creeping through the thin curtains, laying pale stripes across the carpet. Dad's name flashed across my screen again. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Then I answered, "Hello." The silence on the other end lasted just long enough to tell me he hadn't expected me to pick up. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded nothing like the cold, polished certainty I had grown up fearing. It was ragged. Panicked. Abigail. Not Abby. Not that clipped, dismissive tone he used whenever he wanted to remind me I'd disappointed him. My full name. Like he suddenly remembered I was a person. "What is it, Dad?" There was a sharp breath. Then he blurted, "The bank's taking the house." I said nothing. Behind him, I could hear my mother crying. Cabinet doors opening and closing. The low murmur of the television. Then his voice sharpened into accusation. "What did you do?" For a moment, I didn't understand what he meant. Then memory clicked into place. 7 years earlier, right before my second deployment overseas, my parents had asked me to help them refinance. Dad had framed it as temporary, A smart financial adjustment while interest rates were favorable. Just co-sign, he'd said. It'll help secure approval. You've got stable military income. I had signed without hesitation. Because he was my father. Because family was supposed to mean trust. What I hadn't known, what I had never thought to check, was that after the refinance, he had quietly tied the mortgage autopay to the emergency account he had access to. My account. The account he had emptied the day he threw me out. The realization settled slowly. Heavy. Clean. The money that had kept their house afloat had been mine all along. And when he drained it to protect family assets, he'd severed his own lifeline. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the motel wall. On the other end, my father was breathing hard. Well, he snapped. For most of my life, that tone would have sent adrenaline through me, the reflexive need to explain, obey, fix whatever he believed I had broken. But something inside me had shifted on that porch in Maryland. Some old chain had finally snapped. I smiled. Not cruelly. Not triumphantly. Just with the quiet recognition of truth finally arriving exactly where it belonged. Then I ended the call. No speech. No accusation. No explanation. Just silence. The phone buzzed again immediately. I muted it and set it face down. Outside, the Virginia sky was turning gold with sunrise. For the first time in days, I felt calm. Not vindicated. Not healed. Just clear. Some lessons don't need to be taught with anger. Reality usually handles that part just fine. I showered, dressed, and walked across the motel parking lot to the little diner next door. The waitress, a woman in her 60s named Sharon, had started recognizing me by then. She poured coffee before I even sat down. Rough week. I gave a tired smile. You could say that. She nodded like she understood more than she asked. That's something I've always admired about older Americans. The best of them know when kindness matters more than curiosity. I was halfway through my eggs when the television above the counter switched from local weather to national news. The headline froze me in place. Pentagon procurement fraud investigation expands. The anchor's voice sharpened. Sources inside the Department of Defense now confirm widening inquiries into financial irregularities tied to Redstone Federal Logistics and affiliated contractors. My pulse kicked. Sharon noticed. You okay, honey? I didn't answer. On-screen file footage rolled of Redstone executives entering a federal building. Then my own photograph appeared. My official army portrait. The diner went very still. The anchor continued. Earlier reports suggested Major Abigail Reeves was under investigation for unauthorized system access. New information indicates Reeves may instead be central to uncovering the fraud itself. The room blurred for a second. I gripped the edge of the booth. The anchor kept speaking. Military investigators are now examining evidence that Major Reeves's credentials were duplicated by senior systems administrators linked to contractor oversight offices. A man at the counter turned and stared at me. Recognition dawned. I stood slowly. Then my phone exploded with notifications. Texts. Voicemails. News alerts. 27 missed calls. Most from numbers I knew. Former colleagues. Reporters. And my parents. The phone rang again. Dad. I let it ring. Again. Again. Then voicemail. I listened. His voice had changed. Gone was the accusation. Gone was the command. Now there was something almost unrecognizable. Fear and shame. Abby, he said quietly, please call us back. We didn't know. I stared at the message long after it ended. Then Colonel Mercer called. His voice was steady. They've arrested 2 oversight officials and frozen Redstone assets. I closed my eyes. It's over. Not quite. A pause. Then warmth entered his tone. But your name's been cleared, Major, officially. For a moment I couldn't breathe. 21 years of service. A lifetime spent proving myself. And now, in one sentence, my honor had been returned. I thought I'd feel triumph. Instead, I felt grief. For the child who had spent decades chasing her father's approval. For the woman standing on that porch while her family turned her away. For all the years I had mistaken endurance for love. Mercer spoke again. You all right? I looked out the diner window at the brightening Virginia morning. And for the first time in my life I answered honestly. Yes. I think I finally am. By noon, every major news network in the country had my face on their screens. It was a strange thing watching your own army portrait appear beneath a chyron that read, "Decorated officer cleared in Pentagon fraud case." I sat in the same diner booth where an hour earlier I had been a disgraced major hiding in plain sight. Now Sharon kept refilling my coffee while pretending not to stare. The regulars at the counter stole glances in my direction, their expressions shifting from curiosity to recognition to something like respect. I wasn't used to public attention. Military intelligence is built on invisibility. If people know your name, something has usually gone wrong. And for one long week, everything had. Now the truth was surfacing faster than anyone expected. The television anchor explained how investigators had uncovered an internal network of procurement fraud stretching through multiple oversight offices. Redstone Federal Logistics had funneled federal money through shell contractors for years. When I flagged irregularities in their overseas payment structures, 2 senior civilian administrators intercepted my audit requests. Then they cloned my credentials, falsified access logs, and used my profile as a scapegoat. The whole operation had nearly worked. Nearly. But one of the men they trusted, a systems analyst named Victor Salinas, had panicked after seeing how far they intended to push the cover-up. He had turned state's evidence before dawn. His testimony had broken everything open. By 11:30 that morning, federal agents had made arrests in Arlington and Washington. By noon, my suspension was formally lifted. At 12:14, my commanding general called personally. Lieutenant General Howard Whitaker was not a man known for softness. He had spent 37 years becoming exactly the kind of officer history books remember. His voice came through measured and precise. "Major Reeves." "Sir." A pause. Then, "You have my apology." The words landed harder than I expected. "I appreciate that, sir." "No," he said quietly, "you deserved better." I stared at the motel wallpaper while emotion tightened my throat. That was the thing about real leadership. It doesn't hide behind rank when it's wrong. Whitaker continued. "You'll report to Fort Belvoir at 800 tomorrow in full dress uniform. There will be a formal reinstatement and commendation." "Yes, sir." Another pause. Then his tone softened. "Well done, Major." The line clicked dead. For several moments I simply sat there holding the phone. 21 years of service had taught me that praise from men like Whitaker was rare and carefully earned. But all I felt was tired. Deep down tired. The kind that settles into your bones after surviving something your mind still hasn't caught up to. The next call came 3 minutes later. "Mom." I let it ring. Then voicemail. Her voice was shaking. "Abby, sweetheart, please call us. We were wrong. We didn't understand." A sob interrupted her. Then the message ended. I closed my eyes. The old ache rose instantly. That familiar pull to comfort her. To smooth over pain. To become the capable daughter who fixed everyone else's mistakes. But another voice quieter and stronger rose beside it. You do not owe people immediate access just because they suddenly regret hurting you. That truth felt foreign. Almost rebellious. And yet it steadied me. The calls continued all afternoon. Dad. Mom. Dad again. A text. "Please, we need to talk." Another. "The foreclosure notice was a mistake. There's more going on. Please call." I ignored them all. At 5 that evening, Colonel Mercer arrived at the motel. He wore jeans and a navy polo shirt, but somehow still looked like he was conducting command inspection. He handed me a garment bag. Inside was my dress blues. Pressed perfectly. Every ribbon aligned. Every insignia polished. I looked up. "You had these cleaned," he shrugged. "Thought you might need them." That nearly broke me. Not because of the uniform. Because he had noticed what I needed before I asked. That kind of quiet care still catches me off guard. Mercer sat across from me. "You heard from your parents?" I nodded. "And, I don't know." He was silent for a while. Then he said something I've carried with me ever since. "Abigail, forgiveness and access are not the same thing." I looked at him. He folded his hands. You can forgive someone someday and still refuse to let them keep hurting you today. The words settled somewhere deep. I thought about my father standing on that porch. About my mother looking away. About 20 years of trying to become enough for people who only measured worth by usefulness. And for the first time I considered a possibility I had never allowed myself before. Maybe I didn't need their approval to belong to myself. That night alone in the motel room, I carefully hung my uniform on the closet door. The dark blue fabric caught the yellow lamplight. Brass buttons gleamed. Rows of ribbons marked 2 decades of service, sacrifice, and endurance. For years I had worn that uniform, hoping my father might one day see it and understand my worth. Now I understood something better. Its value had never depended on his recognition. At 7:42 the phone rang again. Dad. This time I answered. He inhaled sharply. Abigail. His voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. I said nothing. Then he spoke the words I never thought Frank Reeves would say. I was wrong. Silence stretched between us. Then quietly, I should have trusted my daughter. Something inside me shifted. Not healed. Not whole. But softened. And for the first time since this began, I wondered if shame had finally reached him the way fear never could. I didn't forgive him that night. But I listened. And sometimes listening is the first crack where grace begins to enter. The next morning I stood in front of the motel mirror and buttoned my dress blues, one careful fastening at a time. The motions were automatic. Precise. Familiar. For 21 years this uniform had marked every turning point of my adult life. Promotions. Deployments. Funerals. Homecomings. Victories no civilian would ever hear about. And now somehow it marked this too. Reclamation. I adjusted the ribbons across my chest and looked at my reflection. The woman staring back looked older than she had 2 weeks earlier. Not physically. Something deeper. As though betrayal had burned away the last traces of someone who still believed love could be earned through performance. Outside, Virginia's early sunlight spilled across the motel parking lot. Colonel Mercer was waiting beside his truck, coffee in hand. He looked me over and gave one sharp nod. About time the Army remembered who you are. That made me smile. The drive to Fort Belvoir was quiet. Mercer understood the value of silence. Older soldiers know that some moments deserve room to settle. When we reached post, military police waved us through the gate with formal salutes. A week earlier, another set of MPS had stripped my authority at my apartment door. Now those same gates opened to welcome me back. Life has a way of restoring balance when truth finally catches up. The ceremony was held in the command auditorium. Nothing extravagant. 100 seats. Flags arranged at the front. Rows of officers and civilian staff already seated when I entered. The room rose as one. For a moment I stopped walking. I hadn't expected that. General Whitaker stood near the podium. He met my eyes and gave the slightest nod. It wasn't ceremony. It was respect. I moved forward and took my place. The general's remarks were brief and direct. He spoke about duty, integrity, the cost of institutional failure when good people are doubted too quickly. Then he turned toward me. Major Abigail Reeves acted exactly as an officer should. Her vigilance exposed one of the most serious procurement fraud operations this command has seen in decades. His voice sharpened. We failed her before verifying the truth. That failure will not happen again. The room was utterly still. Then he pinned the Legion of Merit medal to my jacket. As his hand withdrew, he said quietly enough that only I could hear, "You honored the uniform better than we honored you." Emotion rose so suddenly I nearly lost my composure. But Army discipline held. I saluted. He returned it. The applause that followed was long and steady. And all I could think was this. My father had spent 40 years teaching me that approval had to be earned through perfection. Yet here among people who had every reason to judge harshly, acknowledgement had arrived not because I was flawless, but because I had endured truthfully. After the ceremony, officers approached one by one. Some apologized. Some simply shook my hand. Others said nothing at all, their expressions carrying more sincerity than words ever could. Then I saw my phone. 32 missed calls. 20 from my parents. One voicemail had arrived during the ceremony. I stepped into an empty hallway and played it. Dad's voice came through rough and uneven. "Abigail, the sheriff posted final foreclosure papers this morning." A shaky breath followed. "We have 48 hours. Silence." Then, "I know I don't deserve to ask this, but your mother's terrified." His voice cracked. And suddenly, impossibly, I heard not the commanding father of my childhood, but an aging man confronting consequences he no longer knew how to control. He continued, "I was wrong about everything." A pause. Then the sentence that undid me. "I was so afraid of being ashamed of you, I never noticed how proud I should have been." The voicemail ended. I stood there staring at the blank screen. For years, those were the words I had wanted. A child can survive on very little hope if she believes love is still possible. And now here they were arriving decades late and spoken through defeat. Colonel Mercer found me standing there. He read my expression immediately. "What happened?" I handed him the phone. He listened quietly. When it ended, he looked up. "What are you thinking?" I stared down the long, polished hallway of Fort Belvoir, at young officers walking briskly toward work, at the life I had fought to reclaim. Then I answered honestly, "I think I'm tired of letting pain make my decisions." Mercer said nothing. He didn't need to. By afternoon, I was driving north to Maryland. The highway stretched ahead beneath a pale autumn sky. Every mile carried memory. Family road trips. High school debates with my father. The long drive home after West Point graduation when he had said, "Not bad," like it was praise enough to last a lifetime. By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway, dusk had settled. The foreclosure notice was taped to the front door. The American flag still hung neatly from the porch. But the house itself looked smaller somehow. Fragile. Like pride had been the only thing holding it upright. I stepped out of the car. And for the first time in my life, I approached that front door with nothing left to prove. The porch light was already on when I walked up the front steps. For a second, my hand hovered over the same brass doorbell I had pressed a week earlier. That morning, I had stood here frightened, disgraced, and desperate for comfort. Tonight, I stood here restored. Not because the army had cleared my name. Not because the uniform on my shoulders carried fresh recognition. But because somewhere between losing everything and getting it back, I had stopped measuring my worth by whether this door opened for me. I pressed the bell. Footsteps shuffled inside. Then the door opened. My father looked smaller than I remembered. Frank Reeves had always filled a room through sheer force of certainty. Even in retirement, he carried himself like a man who believed control was his birthright. That certainty was gone now. His shoulders sagged. His neatly combed gray hair looked thinner. The skin beneath his eyes had hollowed into shadows. And when he saw me standing there in full dress blues, his face folded in on itself. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he stepped aside. "Please come in." The house smelled exactly as it had my entire childhood lemon polish old books and my mother's lavender hand soap. The familiarity hit harder than I expected. Memory is a strange thing. It can ache even when attached to pain. Mom stood in the living room near the fireplace, twisting a handkerchief between trembling fingers. The moment she saw me, tears spilled down her cheeks. "Abby," I gave a small nod. Not cold, not warm, simply present. She crossed the room and stopped a few feet away as though uncertain she had the right to come closer. That hurt more than anger would have, because it meant she knew what she'd done. We sat in the living room where I had opened Christmas gifts as a child and studied for SAT exams under my father's stern supervision. Now silence filled every corner. Finally, Dad spoke. The bank accelerated the foreclosure after Redstone's assets were frozen. I frowned. "What does Redstone have to do with your mortgage?" His expression tightened. Then shame darkened his face. Years seemed to settle into him all at once. He looked suddenly old. 3 years ago, he said quietly, "I invested our retirement funds with a private equity group." A sick feeling stirred in my stomach. He kept going. "They promised stable returns, conservative growth. They were backed through Redstone affiliates." Of course they were. Contractor shell money laundering often flowed through respectable-looking retirement instruments. For older investors, it was a familiar trap trust, the polished men with brochures and percentages. Dad stared at his hands. When your account became accessible, I used it to cover our mortgage while waiting for the investments to recover. I felt something inside me go still. Not rage. Not even shock. Just clarity. For years he had quietly depended on my money while presenting himself as the provider. The man who had lectured me about responsibility had been surviving on my sacrifices while calling it family stewardship. Mom's voice broke through. I knew some of it. I looked at her. She wept openly now. I told myself he'd fix it. I told myself families help each other. But I knew it wasn't right. There it was. The truth at last. Not monsters. Not villains. Just frightened people whose pride had slowly made cowards of them. Dad looked up at me then, and his voice cracked. I emptied your account because I panicked. He swallowed hard. When the military investigation hit the news, I thought everything would be seized. I thought if I protected what was left. What was left, I asked quietly. He flinched. The question hung there. What was left after years of taking from a daughter he had never truly seen? Tears filled his eyes. The sight stunned me. Frank Reeves did not cry. Not when his own father died. Not when Mom survived breast cancer. Not when I deployed to Afghanistan. But now tears slipped down his face unchecked. And he whispered the words I never thought I would hear. I threw away my child to save a house and still lost both. The room went silent. I looked at this man who had shaped so much of my life through absence disguised as discipline. And for the first time I saw him clearly. Not as the giant whose approval I had chased. Not as the judge whose standards defined me. Just an aging man who had spent his life worshipping control until it cost him the very people he meant to protect. And suddenly I pitied him. Real pity. Not contempt. Not triumph. Mercy. I stood. Both of them looked up frightened I was leaving. Instead, I walked to the front window and looked out at the dark street where I'd once learned to ride a bicycle under my father's watchful eye. Then I turned back. I can stop the foreclosure. Neither of them moved. Dad's face drained of color. Why? It was a fair question. After everything, why? I thought about Colonel Mercer's words. Forgiveness and access are not the same thing. Then I answered. Because if I let bitterness decide who I become, then this wins twice. Mom covered her mouth and sobbed. Dad stared at me like he no longer recognized the daughter standing before him. Maybe he didn't. The frightened girl who once begged for scraps of his approval was gone. In her place stood a woman who had finally learned this. Mercy offered freely is not weakness. It is freedom. The next morning I wired enough money to halt proceedings. Not to erase the past. Not to pretend trust was restored overnight, but to make room for something better than revenge. That evening, after the paperwork cleared, Dad met me at the front door as I prepared to leave. His eyes were red. His hands shook slightly. For a moment he said nothing. Then very softly he spoke my full name. Welcome home, Abigail Reeves. Not ownership. Not expectation. Just pride. At last freely given. I smiled. And this time when he opened his arms, I stepped into them. Some wounds never fully disappear. But healing begins the moment we stop asking pain to tell us who we are. If this story stirred something in your heart, if you've ever had to choose grace when anger felt easier, I hope you'll carry that reflection with you. And perhaps share it with someone who needs it. And if stories like this remind you that it's never too late for truth healing and second chances, I'd be honored if you stayed for the next one. The room went silent the moment the camera zoomed in on the cockpit. My brother dropped his beer. My mother covered her mouth. My father leaned forward so quickly that his recliner nearly tipped. And for the first time in years, nobody said a word. On the television screen, the announcer's voice echoed across the living room. Leading today's demonstration flight is Major Emily Parker. My name, my face, my aircraft. Broadcast live to millions of Americans. The same brother who had called me the family failure stared at the screen as if he'd seen a ghost. The same parents who had spent years defending him couldn't look away. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke, because the pilot flying across the sky wasn't some stranger. It was me, the daughter they'd overlooked, the sister they'd underestimated, the woman they'd stopped believing in years ago. And the strangest part? I had never lied to them. Not once. They simply never cared enough to ask. But to understand how we got there, you have to go back long before the television cameras. Back before the Air Force. Back before the uniforms. Back before the air shows. Back to a small town in Texas. Back to the day my brother's dream became my burden. And eventually, my future. My name is Emily Parker. I'm 34 years old now. But this story really began when I was a little girl growing up outside Wichita Falls, Texas. Back then, everybody knew who Jake Parker was. Jake was my older brother. 3 years older, 3 years louder, 3 years more confident. And according to nearly everyone who knew us, 3 years more talented. If there was a baseball game, Jake was the star. If there was a school event, Jake got attention. If there was a family gathering, relatives asked about Jake first. I wasn't ignored exactly. I was simply second. Second place becomes familiar when you're the younger sibling of someone everybody expects great things from. The funny thing is that I adored him. I really did. When I was 7 years old, I wanted to wear the same baseball cap he wore. When I was 10, I copied the way he talked. When I was 12, I followed him around so much that he started calling me his shadow. Most little sisters probably understand that feeling. The desire to be included, the desire to belong, the desire to hear an older sibling say they were proud of you. Back then, Jake was my hero. And Jake had one dream: flying. He loved airplanes. Loved them. Our bedroom walls were covered with aircraft posters. Fighter jets, bombers. Military aviation magazines stacked everywhere. Air shows were practically holidays in our family. Every summer, Dad loaded us into the truck before sunrise. We'd drive for hours just to watch military aircraft roar across the Texas sky. Jake would stand there with his eyes locked on the horizon, completely mesmerized. One year after watching an F-16 demonstration team perform, he turned to Dad and said something I'll never forget. "One day that'll be me." Dad smiled. "I believe it." Mom smiled too. So do I. Nobody laughed. Nobody doubted him. Not for a second. And honestly, neither did I. Because Jake had the kind of confidence that made other people believe. As we got older, the dream only grew. Jake joined Civil Air Patrol, earned flight experience, studied aviation constantly. Everything in his life pointed toward becoming a military pilot. By high school, teachers talked about him like he was already destined for greatness. The future seemed written. Then reality arrived. It arrived quietly, in the form of a medical examination. I was 15 when it happened. Jake was 18. I remember the day he came home. No excitement. No smile. No celebration. Just silence. The kind of silence that tells you something important has broken. Dad sat with him at the kitchen table for hours. Mom cried. Nobody explained anything to me. Not immediately. I eventually learned the truth. Jake had failed a medical qualification required for the flight path he wanted. Not because he lacked intelligence, not because he lacked skill. His body simply didn't meet the standard. Years of dreaming ended in a single appointment. Just like that, the Air Force dream disappeared, and something inside Jake disappeared with it. The months afterward were difficult, harder than anyone expected. Jake became angry, then withdrawn, then bitter. Not all at once, slowly, like watching a storm gather in the distance. At first, everyone understood, even me. Losing a dream hurts, especially when you've built your identity around it. Mom and Dad became protective, extremely protective. Every conversation revolved around Jake. Every family decision revolved around Jake. Every concern revolved around Jake. Again, I understood, at least initially. But over time, something changed. The family didn't just comfort him. They began excusing him. Everything. His temper, his attitude, his mistakes, his complaints. No matter what happened, the explanation was always the same. He's been through a lot, and he had. But eventually that explanation became permission. Permission to stay angry. Permission to blame others. Permission to stop moving forward. Meanwhile, life kept moving, including mine. One afternoon while helping Dad clean the garage, I found an old aviation magazine. The cover featured an Air Force pilot climbing into a fighter jet. I stared at the image for several minutes. Something stirred inside me. The same feeling Jake used to talk about. The same excitement. The same fascination. That night, I started researching military aviation. Quietly. Secretly. I never told anyone. Not even Jake. Especially not Jake, because by then I already knew how he'd react. The dream belonged to him, not me. At least that's what everyone seemed to believe. Years passed. I graduated high school, worked hard, stayed focused. Made plans. Whenever I talked about military service, Jake rolled his eyes. Whenever I talked about aviation, he laughed. The first time he called me the family failure, I was 21. We were sitting around the dinner table. I had just mentioned applying for officer training. Jake smirked. That's ambitious. Dad looked uncomfortable. Mom stared at her plate. I ignored the comment. Then Jake laughed. You've always been the family failure, Emily. Silence. Nobody corrected him. Nobody defended me. Nobody said a word. The silence hurt more than the insult, because silence can sound a lot like agreement. I looked around the table. My parents avoided eye contact. Jake leaned back in his chair, satisfied. And that's when I learned an important lesson. Sometimes the people who should protect you simply don't. Not because they don't love you, because they're too busy protecting someone else. I never argued, never fought back, never demanded fairness. I simply smiled and kept moving forward. Because while my family was still focused on the dream Jake lost, I was quietly preparing to chase it myself, and none of them had any idea how far I was willing to go. The first time I sat in the cockpit of a military training aircraft, I thought about my brother. Not because he was there. He wasn't. Not because he supported me. He didn't. I thought about him because I knew I was sitting inside the dream he had wanted his entire life. And for a brief moment I felt guilty. That feeling didn't last long. Reality has a way of pushing sentiment aside, especially when you're trying not to fail. When people imagine military flight training, they often picture excitement, speed, adventure, the kind of scenes you see in movies. The truth is much less glamorous. Most days were exhausting. Long hours, constant evaluations, endless studying, pressure that never seemed to disappear. I joined the Air Force shortly after college. At first, nobody in my family took it seriously. Mom assumed it was temporary. Dad thought I'd eventually come home. Jake laughed outright. How long before you quit? I remember that question clearly. We were standing in my parents' driveway. The Texas sun was setting. I'd just finished loading my luggage into the trunk of my car. I looked at him. I'm not quitting. He shrugged. We'll see. That was it. No good luck. No encouragement. No brotherly support. Just doubt. The strange thing is that by then I'd become accustomed to it. Low expectations are surprisingly easy to carry once you've carried them long enough. Military life changed me quickly. Not because it made me tougher, because it forced me to discover how tough I already was. The first year was difficult. Really difficult. There were moments I questioned everything. Moments when failure seemed more likely than success. The standards were demanding. The competition was intense. Everyone around me had talent. Everyone around me wanted the same opportunities. Nobody cared about excuses. Nobody cared about your feelings. Results mattered. Performance mattered. Discipline mattered. And I loved it. For the first time in my life, nobody compared me to Jake. Nobody saw me as somebody's little sister. Nobody viewed me through the lens of family history. I was simply Emily Parker. Responsible for my own success. Responsible for my own failures. It was strangely liberating. One evening during training, I found myself sitting alone outside the barracks. The sun had disappeared. The air was cool. Several aircraft were parked in the distance. Their silhouettes stood against the darkening sky. I remember staring at them for a long time, thinking about home, thinking about family, thinking about the version of myself everyone back in Texas still believed existed. The family failure. The girl who would never accomplish much. The girl nobody worried about because she wasn't the important one. It struck me then how strange life can be. The people who know us longest don't always know us best. Sometimes they become attached to an old version of who we were, even after we've changed, even after we've grown, even after we've become someone entirely different. Boo. Meanwhile, Jake remained the center of gravity back home. At least according to my parents. Every phone call followed the same pattern. Mom would spend 20 minutes talking about Jake, his job, his frustrations, his latest problem, his newest plan. Then she'd ask about me, briefly. Not intentionally. Not maliciously, just habit. Years of family dynamics are hard to break. One Christmas I returned home on leave. The visit lasted 4 days. By the second evening, Jake had already found a way to mock my career. We were sitting in the living room watching football. A commercial featuring military aircraft appeared on television. Jake pointed toward the screen. Remember when I wanted to do that? Nobody answered. He looked at me. I guess somebody had to settle for second place. Mom laughed nervously. Dad cleared his throat. Nobody challenged him. Again. I sat quietly. Again. The silence no longer surprised me. What surprised me was how little it hurt. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped needing their approval. Not completely, but enough. Enough to keep moving. Enough to stay focused. Enough to understand that their opinion wasn't my future. The irony was that Jake himself had inspired my love of aviation. I don't think he ever realized that. When we were kids, I followed him everywhere. Air museums, aviation shows, books about fighter jets, flight simulators. Every interest he loved eventually became something I loved too. The difference was simple. When his path closed, he stopped walking. When mine became difficult, I kept going. That wasn't because I was stronger. It was because by the time I started, I already knew nobody was coming to save me. Nobody was going to carry me. Nobody was going to lower the standards. The responsibility belonged to me. And somehow that made all the difference. So, several years passed. My career advanced steadily. I earned qualifications, completed advanced training, accepted increasingly challenging assignments. Each accomplishment felt meaningful. Not because anyone back home noticed, because I knew how hard I'd worked for it. Success feels different when you've earned it quietly. There's no applause, no celebration, no audience, just private satisfaction. The knowledge that you kept your promises to yourself. One afternoon, I received a call from my mother. The conversation began normally. Weather, family news, small-town gossip. Then she casually mentioned Jake. He's been having a rough time lately. I wasn't surprised. There always seemed to be something. What happened? Work isn't going well. I listened. As always. Then she sighed. You know, your brother had such big dreams. The comment wasn't intended to hurt me, but it did. Because I realized something. Even after all these years, my family still viewed Jake as the dreamer. The one with potential. The one whose future mattered. Meanwhile, I was actively living the life he'd once wanted. And somehow they still didn't see it. Not because I hid it. Because they never looked. A few months later, everything changed. I was stationed at an Air Force base in Nevada when the email arrived. At first, I assumed it was routine. Another administrative notice. Another scheduling update. Something ordinary. Instead, it contained an invitation. An opportunity. The kind of opportunity military aviators spend years hoping for. I read it once. Then again. Then a third time. My hands were shaking slightly by the time I finished. Because the selection board had chosen me for something extraordinary. Something prestigious. Something that would place me on a national stage. For several minutes, I simply stared at the screen, unable to process it. Then I thought about Jake, about my parents, about every family dinner where I'd been overlooked, about every joke, every dismissal, every moment of silence, and for the first time I wondered what would happen if they ever discovered who I had become. For most of my career, I believed success would feel dramatic. I imagined some life-changing moment, a celebration, a speech, a crowd applauding. Instead, one of the biggest moments of my life happened in a quiet office while I sat alone in front of a computer screen. No audience, no music, no fanfare, just an email, and a future I never saw coming. I must have read the message 10 times, maybe more. The words never changed. Neither did the outcome. I had been selected for one of the most prestigious aviation demonstration assignments in the Air Force. The selection process was brutally competitive. Outstanding pilots from across the service applied. Most never made it. Many applied more than once. Some spent years hoping for the opportunity. And somehow my name had ended up on the list. I leaned back in my chair and stared out the window. Aircraft moved across the flight line outside. Maintenance crews worked beneath the Nevada sun. Everything looked exactly the same. But nothing felt the same. Because after years of quiet effort, somebody had noticed. Somebody had looked beyond evaluations and flight hours and seen potential. The realization was overwhelming, not because I needed validation, because I'd spent so many years without it. That evening I called my parents. Part of me wanted to share the news. Part of me still hoped. Even after all those years, even after all the disappointments, there is something inside most daughters that never fully stops wanting their parents to be proud. Mom answered on the second ring. We exchanged the usual greetings, talked about weather, neighbors, family updates. Then I told her, I got selected for something important. Oh, there was genuine interest in her voice. I smiled. One of the biggest opportunities of my career. That's wonderful, honey. For a moment I felt encouraged. Then she asked, did I tell you Jake is thinking about changing jobs? And just like that, the moment disappeared. Not because she meant to hurt me. Because old habits are powerful. The conversation drifted back toward Jake. as it always seemed to. 20 minutes later, we hung up. I sat staring at my phone. Not angry. Not even disappointed. Mostly resigned. I understood my family by then. The rules rarely changed. The following months became some of the busiest of my life. The new assignment required additional preparation, additional training, additional responsibilities. The standards were higher. The expectations were higher. Everything was higher. I loved every minute of it. The work demanded precision, professionalism, discipline. Every detail mattered. Every maneuver mattered. Every decision mattered. There was no room for complacency. And strangely enough, that made me feel alive. Because for years I had quietly carried other people's expectations. Now I was focused entirely on my own. Back home, however, very little changed, at least not from my family's perspective. Whenever I visited Texas, I seemed to step back into the same role. The overlooked daughter, the younger sister, the safe target. One summer afternoon, my parents hosted a family barbecue, the kind of gathering common across America. Paper plates, lawn chairs, children running through sprinklers, country music playing softly in the background. Everybody relaxed, everybody comfortable, at least until Jake arrived. By then he was 37, still charismatic, still funny, still capable of making an entire group laugh. The difference was that the laughter felt different now, less joyful, more defensive. Success had never fully replaced the dream he'd lost, and I think part of him knew it. I was helping Dad near the grill when Jake walked over. Emily. Jake. He glanced at my sunglasses, then at my Air Force shirt. A familiar smirk appeared. I knew what was coming. Some things never change. So how's the military? It's good. You still doing that? I laughed softly. Last time I checked, several relatives nearby chuckled. Jake shook his head dramatically. I figured you'd be tired of playing soldier by now. The conversation around us grew quieter. People sensed tension. They always did. Nobody intervened. They rarely did. I looked at him. I like what I do. He shrugged. Good for you. Then he took a sip of his drink. And here I thought you'd eventually get a real job. Several people laughed awkwardly. The kind of laughter people use when they don't know what else to do. I noticed my mother looking down. My father focusing on the grill. Neither said anything. Again. The moment should have hurt. Years earlier it would have. Instead I found myself feeling something unexpected. Pity. Not for myself. For Jake. Because I suddenly realized he was still fighting a battle that had ended years ago. The dream was gone. The disappointment was real. But he refused to leave that chapter behind. And it was costing him. That evening, after most of the guests had gone home, I sat alone on my parents' back porch. The Texas sky stretched endlessly overhead. Crickets filled the darkness. The air smelled like cut grass and barbecue smoke. Dad eventually joined me. For several minutes we sat quietly. Then he sighed. Your brother gives you a hard time. I smiled. A little. He stared toward the yard. You know he doesn't mean all of it. There it was. The familiar defense. The explanation. The excuse. I had heard versions of it for years. Normally I let it pass. This time I didn't. Dad. Yeah. When was the last time somebody asked him to stop? The question lingered. Neither of us spoke. Finally he looked away. And that answer told me everything. A few weeks later, a major television network announced coverage of an upcoming national air show. The event would attract enormous attention. Millions of viewers. National exposure. The kind of aviation spectacle people planned weekends around. I knew immediately that my family would watch. Jake never missed an air show. Never. Even after all these years. Especially not one this big. The irony wasn't lost on me. The little girl who had followed her brother through aviation museums and air shows was now preparing to fly in one. Not as a spectator. Not as a fan. As part of the show itself. Yet nobody back home knew. Not Jake. Not Mom. Not Dad. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't interested in telling them. Because some truths don't need announcements. Sometimes life reveals them on its own. And when it does, the lesson tends to be unforgettable. The morning of the air show began long before sunrise. Most people only see the performance.
The aircraft.
The smoke trails. The precision formations. The applause. They don't see the preparation. The briefings. The inspections. The hours of planning. The responsibility. And they certainly don't see the quiet moments when a pilot sits alone and realizes thousands, sometimes millions of people are about to watch. I remember standing beside the aircraft while the sky was still dark. The air was cool. The flight line lights reflected against polished metal. Ground crews moved efficiently around us. Everything felt calm, professional, routine. Yet beneath that routine was excitement. Not nervous excitement, gratitude. Because I knew exactly how many people would have traded places with me, including my brother. A few hundred miles away, my family was starting their day too. Though I wouldn't learn the details until later. According to my mother, Jake arrived early, earlier than anyone expected. He carried coffee and donuts, the way he used to whenever a big air show was on television. Apparently he was excited, like a kid again. That part made me smile when I heard it later. Because despite everything, Jake had never stopped loving aviation. Not really. He had simply stopped believing it could be part of his own future. Those are very different things. Back at the airfield, pilots gathered for the final briefing. Weather, safety procedures, flight schedules, communication plans, the usual details. Everyone focused. Everyone professional. Nobody treated the day casually. The crowd expected perfection. And perfection requires preparation. As the briefing concluded, one of the senior officers looked around the room, then smiled. "Let's give them a show they'll remember." The room responded with quiet confidence, not arrogance. Professional pride. There is a difference. Meanwhile, my parents had settled into the living room. My father occupied his favorite recliner. My mother sat on the couch. Jake claimed the seat closest to the television. Some things never change. The network coverage began around noon. Commentators discussed aircraft, pilots, history, upcoming demonstrations. Jake reportedly corrected the announcers several times, at least according to my mother. That sounded exactly like him. For all his flaws, he knew aviation. Always had. He pointed out aircraft models, explained maneuvers, shared facts nobody else knew. For a little while, the old Jake returned. The enthusiastic boy from those childhood air shows. The brother I used to admire. The brother I missed. By early afternoon, I was climbing into the cockpit. That moment never gets old. The smell, the equipment, the routine. Every pilot develops habits, personal rituals, small actions that signal it's time to focus. I followed mine carefully. Checklists, communications, systems, everything exactly as trained. Everything exactly as practiced. Then I looked out across the airfield. Thousands of spectators filled the viewing areas. Families, veterans, children, aviation enthusiasts, people from all over America. Some wore military hats decorated with unit patches. Others carried folding chairs and cameras. Many had been attending air shows for decades. I felt honored to be there, truly. Because opportunities like this don't belong to one person. They're built on years of support from instructors, mentors, crews, and teammates. Nobody reaches that stage alone. The demonstration began. Aircraft launched. Formations assembled. The performance unfolded exactly as planned. From the cockpit, the world looked different. Cleaner. Simpler. Focused. There is a unique clarity that comes during flight. The noise disappears. The distractions disappear. Only the mission remains. For a while, family never entered my mind. Neither did Jake. I was too busy flying. Too busy doing the job? Back in Texas, the television broadcast continued. The commentators introduced various segments. Different aircraft. Different pilots. Different demonstrations. My family watched casually. Interested. Entertained. Completely unaware of what was coming. Then the production team switched to a featured segment. A closer look at one of the demonstration pilots. The camera followed a pilot walking toward an aircraft. Helmet under one arm. Flight gear perfectly fitted. Professional. Confident. The announcer began speaking. And everything changed. According to my father, Jake stopped moving first. Not speaking. Not breathing. Moving. The announcer continued. Leading today's demonstration is Major Emily Parker. My name. Clear as day. Impossible to misunderstand. My mother later told me she thought she'd heard it wrong. She looked at the screen. Then looked again. Then sat frozen. The camera zoomed closer. Close enough to remove all doubt. There I was. Not someone who looked like me. Not someone with the same name. Me. The daughter. The sister. The family failure. Elio. The room went completely silent. Nobody knew what to say. For years, they had imagined my military career as something small, ordinary, temporary. Background noise. Now reality was sitting in their living room. Broadcast nationwide. Impossible to ignore. The silence lasted several seconds. Maybe longer. Nobody remembers exactly. Shock has a strange effect on time. The aircraft accelerated. The demonstration continued. And for the next several minutes, my family watched without speaking. Every maneuver, every formation, every pass across the sky. Jake never looked away. Neither did my parents. Years of assumptions were collapsing in real time. The daughter they overlooked. The sister they underestimated. The dream they thought belonged only to Jake. All of it unfolding before them. Not through an argument. Not through revenge. Not through confrontation. Through truth. When the broadcast ended, nobody rushed to speak. Nobody joked. Nobody changed the subject. The room remained quiet. My father eventually stood, walked into the kitchen, then came back, still speechless. My mother wiped tears from her eyes. Jake remained seated, staring at the blank television screen, the same screen that had just revealed everything. The next morning, while I was reviewing post-event schedules at my temporary quarters, somebody knocked on the door. A firm knock. Unexpected. I opened it, and found my brother standing there. He looked exhausted, like a man who hadn't slept. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Jake took a deep breath, and said the last thing I ever expected to hear from him. "We need to talk." For most of my life, I imagined what I would say if Jake ever admitted he was wrong. I pictured arguments, long speeches, years of frustration finally pouring out. I imagined telling him exactly how much he'd hurt me, exactly how many family dinners I'd endured, exactly how many times I'd sat quietly while everyone acted as if my life didn't matter. But when I opened that door and saw him standing there, none of those speeches seemed important anymore. Because Jake didn't look like a man ready to argue. He looked like a man carrying something heavy, something he'd been carrying for years. Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside. Sure. The room was quiet, small, temporary. Military housing isn't glamorous. Never has been. Jake looked around. His eyes settled on framed photographs sitting on a shelf. Flight school. Graduation ceremonies. Squadron pictures.
Awards.
Years of memories. Years of work. Evidence of a life he had never bothered to ask about. For several moments he simply stared. Then he shook his head. "I didn't know." "No," I said gently. "You didn't." We sat across from each other at a small kitchen table, the same way we'd sat across from each other at hundreds of family meals. Yet this felt entirely different. For once, nobody else was there. No parents, no relatives, no audience. Just us. Jake folded his hands together, then unfolded them, then folded them again. A nervous habit I'd almost forgotten he had. Finally, he spoke. "When did all this happen?" I smiled. "What part?" He gestured toward the photographs. "The career." "The flying." "The air show." I laughed softly. "Over the last 12 years. The answer wasn't meant to be sarcastic. But it landed that way anyway. Because the truth was obvious. My life hadn't been a secret. He simply hadn't been paying attention. Jake stared down at the table. "I feel stupid." I considered that. Then shook my head. "No." His eyes lifted. "No. No, I think you're finally being honest." That answer seemed to surprise him. For several seconds he sat quietly. Then he nodded. "Fair enough." The conversation moved slowly after that, like two people trying to cross a damaged bridge. Carefully, one step at a time. Eventually, Jake leaned back in his chair. "I hated watching that air show." The statement caught me off guard. "Hated it." He nodded. "I was proud of you." Then he looked away, and I hated it. Now I understood. Not because I shared his feelings, because I finally understood their source. "Why?" I asked. Jake laughed bitterly. "Because that was supposed to be me." There it was. The truth. Not jealousy. Not really. Grief. Old grief. Unresolved grief. The kind people carry so long they forget they're carrying it. For the next hour, Jake talked more honestly than I had ever heard him talk before. He told me about the medical disqualification, the embarrassment, the humiliation, the feeling of watching his future disappear. I already knew most of the facts. What I didn't know were the emotions behind them. The fear, the shame, the anger, the loneliness. For years, everyone had focused on the dream he lost. Very few people had focused on the person who lost it, including Jake himself. I kept thinking I'd find something else," he admitted. "Something that felt the same." "Did you?" He shook his head. "No." The answer came immediately. Too immediately. The kind of answer somebody has lived with for years. "I got jobs." He shrugged. "I made money. I paid bills. But none of it ever felt like flying." I nodded. understanding more than he realized. Because every person reaches a point where they discover the difference between making a living and feeling alive. Jake never found the second part. Then his eyes met mine. And then there was you. I stayed quiet. You kept going. Another pause. You lived the dream. The words sounded painful, but also freeing. Like finally admitting something he'd spent years avoiding. I nodded slowly. Yes. For the first time in my life, I didn't minimize it. Didn't soften it. Didn't apologize for it. I had earned it. And both of us knew it. Jake rubbed his face. I think I started blaming you. The honesty startled me, even though I'd suspected it for years. You? He nodded. It didn't make sense. I knew that. But every time you succeeded, his voice trailed off. I finished the sentence for him. It reminded you. He nodded. Exactly. Every achievement, every promotion, every step forward had reminded him of the path he'd lost. And because he couldn't fight the loss, he fought the reminder. Me. The strange thing was that hearing the truth didn't make me angry. It made me sad. Because I suddenly saw how much energy he'd wasted. Years of resentment. Years of comparison. Years spent staring backward instead of forward. And for what? Nothing. Not 1 minute of it had changed the past. A few days later, our parents joined us for dinner. The atmosphere was awkward at first. Nobody quite knew how to begin. Then my mother surprised everyone, including herself. She started crying. Not dramatically, quietly. The kind of crying that comes from realization. We failed you, she said. I blinked. What? She looked directly at me. We failed you. The room went silent. Dad stared at the table. Jake looked down. Mom continued. We were so worried about your brother. Her voice trembled. We forgot you needed us too. I didn't know what to say. Because I'd imagined apologies before. Many times. But reality felt different. Messier. More human. Less satisfying. And somehow more meaningful. Dad finally spoke. We thought we were helping him. You were, I said. He nodded. Maybe. Then he sighed. But we stopped seeing what it was costing you. Nobody argued. Because everybody knew it was true. Eventually the conversation softened. The tension eased. The honesty remained. For the first time in years, we weren't pretending. And that mattered. More than revenge. More than being right. More than winning. Before leaving that evening, Jake walked me to my car. The sun was beginning to set. The sky glowed orange over the Texas horizon. He stood quietly for a moment, then asked a question. A simple question, but one that carried the weight of years. Why didn't you ever tell us? I looked at him, and for the first time I knew exactly how to answer. For years I thought I knew exactly how I would answer that question. Why didn't you ever tell us? I imagined saying something dramatic, something sharp, something that would finally make everyone understand. But standing there beside my car looking at my brother, I realized the answer was much simpler than that. I did tell you. Jake frowned. What? I told you every time somebody asked. The confusion remained. So I smiled. I joined the Air Force. He nodded. I know. I told you when I graduated training. Another nod. I told you when I got promoted. Yeah, I told you when I changed assignments. His expression slowly shifted. The pieces were finally connecting. I wasn't talking about secrets. I was talking about attention. For years, the information had been available. Nobody had listened. Not really. Not completely. Not with genuine curiosity. Jake stared toward the fading horizon, then laughed quietly. A sad laugh. The kind people make when they finally recognize a truth they'd spent years avoiding. We never asked. No, we didn't. And somehow those 3 words carried more honesty than anything he'd said before. Oh, on the flight home the next day I spent a lot of time looking out the window. Clouds stretched endlessly beneath the aircraft. The world seemed peaceful from 30,000 feet. Smaller somehow. Less complicated. Distance has a way of doing that. Problems that feel enormous on the ground often look different from above. Not insignificant. Just easier to understand. For years I had carried resentment toward my family. Not overwhelming resentment. Not hatred. Just a quiet ache. The ache of feeling unseen. The ache of watching someone else's pain matter more than your own. The ache of realizing that being the dependable child often means receiving less attention than the struggling one. Many people my age understand that feeling, especially those who grew up in families where one person's crisis became everybody else's priority. Looking down at those clouds, I finally understood something. My parents hadn't loved me less. They had simply worried about Jake more. Those aren't the same thing, and while that realization didn't erase the hurt, it helped me understand it. Understanding changes things. Over the next several months, something unusual happened. My family started paying attention. Not in a dramatic way. Not overnight. Slowly. Naturally. Mom called more often. Not to discuss Jake, to ask about me. The first time it happened, I almost laughed. She called one evening while I was making dinner. After a few minutes of conversation, she asked, "So what are you working on these days?" I actually paused because I couldn't remember the last time she'd asked. Not politely. Not out of obligation. With genuine interest. We spent nearly 40 minutes talking. About aviation. Travel. Career goals. Life. When we hung up, I stood in my kitchen for a long moment. Smiling. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive with grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives through small questions that should have been asked years ago. Dad changed too. Though in his own way. One afternoon he mailed me a newspaper clipping. A local article about aviation. Nothing particularly special. Except for the handwritten note attached. Saw this and thought of you. Love, Dad. That was it. 12 words. Yet I probably read them 20 times. Because after years of feeling overlooked, even small signs of recognition carry enormous weight. So, the biggest change, however, came from Jake. Not immediately. Growth rarely happens immediately. But it happened. Gradually. Steadily. One choice at a time. For the first time in years, he stopped comparing our lives. Stopped measuring his losses against my successes. Stopped treating every accomplishment of mine as evidence of his failure. The transformation wasn't dramatic. It was something better. It was real. One evening he called me unexpectedly. I signed up for flight lessons. I nearly dropped my phone. What? He laughed. You heard me. I sat down. Honestly stunned. At 37 years old, Jake wasn't trying to become a fighter pilot. That chapter was over. He knew it. I knew it. But for the first time in nearly 2 decades, he was reconnecting with the thing he loved instead of mourning the thing he lost. That mattered. A lot. How was it? I asked. There was a pause. Then I heard something I hadn't heard from him in years. Pure excitement. It was incredible. And just like that, I heard the boy from those childhood air shows again. The boy who stared at airplanes with wonder. The boy who dreamed without bitterness. The boy I'd missed. The following summer, another major air show came to Texas. This time my family attended in person. Not because I asked. Because they wanted to. Mom brought sunscreen. Dad brought binoculars. Jake showed up wearing an aviation cap that looked older than some of the spectators. The sight made me laugh. Before the event began, we stood together near the flight line. The sun was bright. The crowd was enormous. Children pointed toward aircraft. Veterans shared stories. Families spread blankets across the grass. America has a special relationship with air shows. They're part celebration, part history lesson, part family tradition. Standing there with my parents and my brother felt strangely emotional, not because I was flying, because for the first time in years we were sharing the experience together. No resentment, no competition, no old arguments, just family. Later that afternoon, after the demonstration ended, we sat together watching the crowd disperse. Jake nudged my shoulder, a familiar gesture from childhood. I was wrong about you. I smiled. You were wrong about a lot of things. He laughed. Fair enough. Then his expression softened. I'm proud of you, Em. The words were simple, ordinary. Yet somehow they meant more than any television broadcast ever could. Because this wasn't about being seen by millions of strangers. It was about being seen by the people who mattered. As I look back now, I realize something important. The greatest victory wasn't appearing on television. It wasn't earning wings. It wasn't proving anybody wrong. The greatest victory was learning that my worth never depended on their approval. Not my brother's. Not my parents'. Not anyone's. Once I understood that, everything changed. Success became lighter. Relationships became healthier. Life became richer. And maybe that's the lesson hidden inside this story. Sometimes the people closest to us don't see us clearly. Sometimes they underestimate us. Sometimes they carry wounds that prevent them from recognizing our strengths. But we don't have to wait for recognition before moving forward. We don't have to wait for applause before becoming who we're meant to be. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life, or perhaps a chapter of your own journey, I hope you'll take a moment to reflect on it. And if you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or quietly working towards something meaningful, remember this. Keep going. The people around you may not see your progress right away, but that doesn't make it any less real. And if you enjoyed spending this time with me, I'd be honored if you'd share your thoughts, share this story with someone who might need it, and join me again for another journey.